ELI5 How did banks clear checks and get funds from other banks before computerization? By hand. They send it to your local branch where they had written records of your details, and they would confirm or deny that you had the funds, were a customer, etc., and then send that back. Every night after the close of business, there were scores of airplanes carrying paper checks from one city to the other. Had to spend the night once at a small hotel at the Greenville, NC airport, and was shocked at the number of planes taking off and landing at night. Turns out Greenville was a regional center for check clearing. Thanks for the awards. Makes not getting any sleep that night worth it. I used to run a magnet over the routing number and account number on my car payment check so that they'd have to manually enter it. Bought me an extra day or two. If I recall correctly, one avenue for young, newly minted commercial pilots to build hours, make money was to fly interstate checks for banks. Overnight, they would literally pick up bags and bags of paper checks from banks during off hours and literally fly them overnight to their destination so they could be processed through in the system. Not sure if there is still such a market for this, but I know people still write checks and they have to be physically transferred between states. I think kids these days don't know about floating checks to pay your rent, or writing a check for a penny to yourself to get cash back from the grocery store, to float yourself, and then hoping your paycheck clears before the check clears. Memories. Fun story. When I was a kid, my parents shopped at an Air Force Base commissary. Back when they had great prices and no tax. Cigarettes were around $10 per carton, so they did a ton of business. Well, one day they got robbed and the thief took off with a huge bag of checks. Accidentally, I assume. Everyone who wrote a check that day essentially got their groceries for free because there was a way to process missing checks. Watch Catch Me If You Can. Back then everything was manual, so if you wrote a check or even cashed a check in LA, that check had to be physically mailed to your home branch, and when they got it, they would deduct the funds from your account. Checks are delivered to a clearinghouse, and then presented for payment to the bank they're drawn on, who adjusts their ledger appropriately. The banks would then work out who owed what to whom and settle the balance between them. Doesn't Catch Me If You Can with Leo cover some of this? How the US was split into different zones and how he was using that detail to get cash, knowing he had a certain amount of time before anyone would notice. The manual system of reconciling checks also resulted in the infamous, it takes 10 days for a check to clear. It was really less time. But the banks like to keep your money for as long as they can. You know those old Western movies where they rob a wagon full of money? Some of those were bank wagons. LOL. Playing the float was how college me got food sometimes. Write the check on wed night, payday Friday wouldn't clear till Monday. Watch Catch Me If You Can. It breaks down how he was able to forge checks due to the delay in processing and verification. It also shows how modern technology slowed his forging and why he had to go abroad because technology was behind in Europe. I worked on the adjustments department of a bank for over 10 years in the 80s. Researching forged items, I found it fascinating to find a source of receipt, and trace a check all the way to the origin. FRB statements and microfiche. I miss it. I can tell you, working at a grocery store as a cashier in the 90s, we would pass out a binder with names and pics of people who have wrote bad checks and never owned up to them. Watch Catch Me If You Can. Checks were wild before computers. It's a movie about a true story of a teenager was able to scam $4.5 million through fraudulent checks, and it took like 2 years for the FBI to catch him. They actually go over how it was possible for someone like him to evade capture that long. By mail. My mom and my aunt in the 60s and 70s used to write each other checks to go shopping. It would take 2 weeks to clear. Lol. Pony Express and Telegraph. How far back are we talking? They used to fly checks to banks. So I'd imagine that they did it all by hand. Source. Pilot who's listened to stories of aircraft carrying checks before my time. You used to be able to count on a check not being cashed for about 14 business days in my day. It was great. Banks would process the checks at regional locations, then send it to clearing houses where they would send the checks to respective banks. In a similar vein to cashing checks before payday, I have a prepaid debit card that pays cashback at certain retailers. My bank allows me to spread qualifying payments over 3-month and no cost and 6, 9 and 12 month at interest. I've worked out that if it's a tough month, I can pay money into my cashback card and use it for groceries and then spread that cost over 3 months with my bank. It's like a free mini loan. Regular CR. This reminds me about how the place I work took checks to payment via phone. They would have to print checks on a printer with special ink for each check that they got over the phone. I think the sale of the ink was controlled. Mica ink, I think it was called. By literally physically transporting the checks, or CR. Used to be a distant check could take 4 to 5 days to clear. Due to work, I had an account several states away. I'd write checks on money I didn't have a few days before payday. Always went through okay. Saved my ass grocery-wise more than once. Don't forget to share, like and subscribe for more content.